Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming back. So last time we met, I had a little bit of a heat stroke. I'm not sure what it was, but I wasn't feeling well. But I didn't want to give up on that lecture, and I returned to my office and decided to have some fun and record a lecture for you, and draw a little bit, relax, lighten up the mood a little bit, and just go on. So with that in mind, I've created a lecture here called Archaeological Dating Methods. And here I'm going to ask you the basic question. What are the two basic kinds of dating methods? Two general categories, let's call them that. General categories of dating methods. And as you recall, or may recall, I told you what they were. And those were, one, absolute dating. And two, relative dating. Now in class, I elaborated mostly on number two here, relative dating. But just a brief summary. Relative dating is a date expressed in relative terms, or I should say, a relative date is a date expressed in relative terms. Or perhaps I should say it is a date given in relation, date given in, or I should say it's an age expressed by its relationship to another. Maybe I should clarify this another way. What is a date? Well, a date is really a specific moment in time, isn't it? Like July 5th, 1492. Actually, that's an absolute date, of course, a very specific date on a particular calendar. But any date is a specific moment in time. So even though I may say we're trying to get a date on something, really we're trying to find out its age. And in this case, we're trying to find out its age. Or rather, I should say, in the case of a relative date, we're trying to find out its age relative to something else. To some other age, event, or even a date, I suppose. Whereas an absolute date is a date expressed in some specific quantifiable unit of time. And by a specific quantifiable unit of time, I mean something like a year, or even a day, or a season. No, well, I guess it's a year would be the typical thing that we say for a specific date, but it could be a day, right? Or a decade, a century. It could be any of those things. The 3H system that I went over in the first few weeks of class is a typical relative dating system that we use in European archaeology all the time. The Stone Age is when people were using stone tools, or stone was the main tool, that main cutting type tool that was being used. And then along comes the Bronze Age, and people are switching and using bronze from now on. And then, of course, the Iron Age. So if I say something dates to the Bronze Age, really, if you know nothing else, all you know is that it's relatively older than the Iron Age and relatively newer than the Stone Age. Of course, archaeologists have tried to give them dates, like the Bronze Age beginning, say, at 3000 BC and ending perhaps 1000 BC, depending on where you are. Unless I can give you a specific year for the object that we're dating, or for the archaeological site that I'm dating, it's still a relative age if I say that it's a Bronze Age site. But in the field, archaeologists are using relative dating all the time. Let's say an archaeologist is excavating a test unit here. This is the land. We'll put a little bit of grass on there. All right, so you know that it's the land surface. Sorry, I'm having fun, guys. Don't worry, it's all recorded, so you can speed this up or slow it down or stop it however you. And let's say you excavate a test unit here. All right, this is a 1 meter by 1 meter test unit. And we just talked about excavation. So what does that mean? If you dig a 1 meter by 1 meter test unit, well, a test unit is your standard square excavation unit size. And if we're going to draw it in 3 dimensions, it would look a little bit like so. Now, as an archaeologist is excavating, they are recording, of course, right where they find things. You know, in our imaginary test unit here, just say I've got things in the profile. There's 4 different artifacts that I've discovered, and based on the law of superposition, which states that in any sequence of flat-lying strata, those at the bottom are older than those at the top. Of course, that only applies if this hasn't been disturbed culturally or whatnot. You learned a little bit about reverse stratigraphy in the last chapter. But in this case, I would carefully record that artifact A is higher in the profile than artifact B, which is higher in the profile than artifact C, which is higher in the profile than artifact D. And if the law of superposition applies to this test unit, then I could say that A is more recent than B is more recent than C, and C is more recent than D. This is a typical application of relative dating. Within a single test unit, of course. Now, back in the old days of archaeology, by that I'm going to go ahead and say the 1950s or 40s, let's just say, relative dating was the only game in relative dating was the only game in town. They didn't have any way to generate absolute dates for the most part. Occasionally, if you were dealing with, historical archaeology, you might have a historical text that could provide you with some, dating context. For example, let's suppose you're finding, you find a coin on an archaeological site. And let's just say that a coin expert, also known as a numismatist, can tell you that that coin was minted, say, in 90 A.D., and you find this at your archaeological site. I suppose prior to the days of absolute dating, you could use this to provide you a date. Actually, but even then, I suppose it would be a relative date, because unless you found the coin, amidst your archaeological site, chances are you found your objects either above or below that coin where you found it, and there you're back to having a relative date. You might know that it's older than or younger than a 90 A.D. Actually, usually if you were to find a coin like this in an archaeological site, you would date that terminus post quem, TPQ for short. Which means your archaeological site must have been deposited after 90 A.D., terminus post quem. So I give that site a TPQ date of at least 90 A.D., because obviously this coin couldn't have been deposited before 90 A.D. if we know that it was minted in 90 A.D. So the site is deposited sometimes after 90 A.D. But a coin collector, I could have a 90 A.D. Roman coin in my office right now, and if I were to drop that in an archaeological site, or if I were to drop that in a site, or just throw it into a fire pit or lose it on my property at home, that wouldn't make that, obviously that site wouldn't date to 90 AD, it would date to 2018 when I lost it. But you can say that an archaeological site that has a datable object like a coin would be at least as old, I should say, it would date, the oldest it could date would be the date of the coin. That's a TPQ date. But for prehistoric archaeology, there's no relative dating was really all there was prior to the 1950s. But archaeologists developed very elaborate ways to determine how old archaeological sites were. And one of the methods I want to go over with briefly right now was called seriation. 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 Seriation depended upon the development of typologies. So archaeologists were out there excavating archaeological sites, stratified archaeological sites, where you had objects coming out like pottery, and you might have jars, and say this one was discovered at a higher in the profile than, say, this pot over here, and that was discovered higher in the profile than, say, this pot over here. Of course, they weren't typically finding entire pots. They were finding potsherds. Nonetheless, they could make an argument that type 1, 2, and 3 were in that sequence in terms of age. So 1 was the youngest, 2 was in the middle, and 3 was the oldest. Now, there's a curious thing about pottery, and actually all artifacts, and that is that they often have decorations that are not really functional in nature. They're just a matter of style. All right. So the archaeologists would find these pottery types, and they would name them things like black on white, and maybe white on black, and let's call this one corrugated redware. And sometimes they'd have a culture associated. So this might be Mimbres black on white. This might be Mimbres white on black, and this might be whatever, something else. And once they discovered this, then they knew the sequence. Then if they came to another archaeological site and they only found potsherds, they could take a look at the potsherd and they could say, aha, this seems to match my style of corrugated ware. So this archaeological site must be older than a site that contains Mimbres white on black or Mimbres black on white pottery. But interesting thing about styles. Let's suppose when this type 3 starts out, where there's an archaeological site here. We'll call this site 1. And this site is filled full of this corrugated redware. And so this archaeological site, this bar here represents 100%. So this bar right here represents 100% of the pottery found at this site number 1 is this corrugated ware. But styles are styles, and over time things go out of style. Let's just say that there's another site, site 2, and it also has some pottery. And let's just say, though, that it doesn't have 100%. Let's just say it has 95%, because the pottery is going out of style. that type is going on. But what's replacing it? Well, what's replacing it, we know from earlier, the pottery that eventually replaces it is this pottery type number 2 here. So if site 2 has 95% of this other type, well, then this is going to have, there's going to be, a small amount of pottery here, 5%, say, of the pottery at site 2 turns out to be type number 2, which is this Mimbres black on white. So let's take a look at site 3. This pottery over here, this corrugated redware, continues to decline in popularity. We'll say this is, 50%, and 50% of the pottery is Mimbres black on white, and so forth and so on, until the pottery is more or less completely replaced by this other pottery style. But just as this style, this black on white style, or white on black rather, is taking over, it also eventually will decline in popularity to be replaced by another style. And let me speed this up for you here. If you have, and then this one, and then you have this one. Okay. All right. All right. All right. So this is a hypothetical model of change through time based on archaeological finds, with the oldest site being site number 1, and time moving in this direction, and the youngest site being site number 10. Well, let's suppose you find an archaeological site, and it has, let's just say it has 25% of type 2, and it has 75% of type 1, or of type 3. And this is the type 3 is the corrugated redware, and the 25% is the white on black. Once this table has been created, and once archaeologists formulated a table like this back in the 1950s, they could take a new site like this one, and they could see right where it would fit. And let's see where would it fit. 50-50, 25, 20, or 5. This was 5. No, this is 95.5. So it looks like our new site would fit right in here somewhere, in between the ages of sites 2 and 3. Let's suppose we have a site, a surprisingly different site that's 1/3 of each type. Well, where would you put it? Well, there is no site that has all 3. And there's certainly not one that contains 1/3 of each. So you would have perhaps a new problem to solve. But your site is probably going to be in this range right in here. It's going to be somewhere in 4, 5, and 6. Certainly it is older than site 7 probably, and 8, 6, and maybe even 5. But it's somewhere right in that range. So really all you can say is that it's not a recent site, it's not an old site, it's a site somewhere in the middle, which is why you call this kind of date relative, right? This is a relative dating mechanism. And you call this entire procedure seriation. That's S-E-R-I-A-T-I-O-N. Seriation. It's this process of obtaining a relative date by comparing artifact frequencies of unknown sites with the artifact frequencies of known sites. You probably want to see that written down, don't you? All right, we'll call that seriation. Seriation. A relative dating technique that compares the artifact frequencies at unknown sites, artifact frequencies at sites of unknown age to the artifact frequencies of sites of known age. All right. Seriation, a relative dating technique that compares the artifact frequencies at sites of unknown age to the artifact frequencies at sites of, hold on a second. Let's call that, let's say at sites of known age. It's based on the assumption that one cultural style slowly replaces an earlier style over time. And archaeologists construct these sort of master frequency diagrams called seriation diagrams or seriation tables. And if I could just go back to the previous slide for a moment. These seriation tables are often described by archaeologists as being battleship shaped. Now that's something that you're going to see in the literature, and it may not make a lot of sense to you, but it makes a lot of sense to archaeologists who came up with these terms. And they said that this looks like a battleship, they said. So if you hear the textbook referring to a battleship-shaped diagram, they're referring to this right here. These things here. And all that simply means is that you have a style that, that styles come into style, and they increase in frequency, and then they go down in style with time, or they go down in frequency through time. And of course, a lot of styles do this. I think in class the other day I gave you the example of pop-top soda cans. Let's see. these soda cans. A modern soda can, I guess, has some kind of has a little hole here that is, I can't draw this. Let me see, let's just draw the top. Your soda can today has a pull tab, has a hole that you drink out of, I guess, like so. And then it has, there's a tab in there that comes out, and you have, I don't know why I'm drawing this for you since you know what it is. Let's see, and it has a little thing right here. Call this pull lid here, and you open it, and it opens. All right, so it does that. But prior to, or in the 1970s, you had something else. You had these soda cans, and they would have a similar opening, a little narrower, I think. And you'd have a ring that pulled all the way off, and you'd end up with this little ring, and then a little curled piece of metal that was that used to be in that hole there, and that would be garbage. So your cans look different. This is 1970s, and this is, say, 1980s plus. And I'm just being very general with my age estimates here. And the point is, if you find an archaeological site that is, 100% of these pop top cans, then you probably know that this site dates to the 90s or later. But if you find a site that's 100% of these pull tab cans, you know that it's probably from the 1970s. And if you find an archaeological site that's 50-50, then you probably know it's from the transitional period when these cans were going out of style. And that, my friends, is the basis of seriation, which more or less concludes our section on relative dating.